In late January 1943, the German Ninth Army faced encirclement east of Smolensk. Soviet pressure from Operation Mars had drained ammunition, fuel, and morale. The front line near the town of Cholm had collapsed into isolated pockets of resistance. Among the Wehrmacht's attempts to stabilize the defense, one overlooked decision came from a sniper detachment of the 218th Infantry Division. What began as a desperate measure to slow Soviet advances turned into an experiment that, within 2 days, altered the tactical doctrine in the sector. German snipers at this stage were not elite assassins, but reconnaissance sharpshooters trained to disrupt command structures. Their success depended less on marksmanship and more on concealment and observation. In the chaos of retreat, Oberstleutnant Hermann Balke, commanding the sector, allowed a group of snipers to reorganize into a dispersed micro-network across the no-man's land, each pair equipped with captured Soviet rifles, stripped of serial numbers to mislead enemy intelligence. The crazy plan was simple yet radical. Instead of targeting officers or gunners, the snipers would attack communication flow, radio operators, messengers, and field telephones. The hypothesis was that eliminating links rather than leaders would induce paralysis faster than traditional attrition. The idea ran counter to standard Wehrmacht doctrine, which emphasized decapitation of command. However, the division's loss of artillery coordination left few alternatives. At dawn on February 2nd, the first stage began. The snipers infiltrated forward positions before daybreak, hiding in frozen trenches abandoned by retreating units. Their presence was unknown to both German and Soviet infantry. Within hours, Soviet patrols advancing through the gaps noticed strange patterns, units receiving no orders, counterattacks failing to synchronize. Reports from the 33rd Army recorded inexplicable silence in radio nets. The Soviet command believed German reinforcements had cut communication lines. In reality, a handful of sharpshooters with precision and patience had begun dismantling a regiment's nervous system. Within hours, the micro-network's effects multiplied. Radio silence and failed relays forced Soviet regimental staffs to rely on runners and visual signals across frozen, shell-pocked terrain. Those alternatives had predictable delays. Runners were vulnerable to intermittent sniper fire and artillery. Semaphore lines required clear sight lines that did not exist in the shattered woodlands, and pre-arranged timetables could not adapt to rapidly shifting local contact. Commanders attempting to mass local firepower discovered battalions that failed to appear or launched piecemeal, uncoordinated assaults. The Germans exploited this systemic breakdown. Artillery observers, previously hampered by disrupted phone lines, could now call in limited, well-timed concentrations against exposed assembly areas. Logistics convoys, guided by reconnaissance reporting gaps rather than frontline report chains, slipped through gaps the Soviets had assumed were secure. Small mobile engineer teams repaired selected field cables at night, creating deceptive corridors of functioning communication that channeled Soviet attention away from critical nodes. Soviet countermeasures shifted abruptly, increased patrol density, aggressive sweeps aimed at suspected sniper hides, and the redeployment of signal corps detachments to re-establish redundancy. These moves had opportunity costs. Forces diverted to hunt snipers left other axes thin, which compounded the original paralysis. Intelligence summaries from the sector noted a spike in command friction and rising casualty rates among signal troops, figures that fed a growing systemic slowdown in offensive tempo. By the end of the second day, the cumulative effect was visible. Planned Soviet thrusts stalled, reserves were committed piecemeal, and the operational rhythm of an entire army slowed to a crawl. The micro-network had not destroyed manpower outright. It had attacked the flow of information and timing, the arteries of combined arms warfare, achieving disproportionate effect with limited resources. The German command at Cholm did not initially grasp what had occurred. Reports from forward observers simply noted localized stabilization. Yet intercepted Soviet traffic and prisoner interrogations revealed a striking pattern. Coordination had failed across entire regiments, though frontline strength remained intact. This anomaly drew attention from the divisional staff, which soon identified the common denominator: sniper interference in communications rather than direct attrition. By early February 3rd, the experiment received informal recognition. Balk's headquarters issued an order to expand the approach. All marksmen, scouts, and available volunteers with optics were to target the enemy's communication lines, runners, and liaison points instead of riflemen or officers. In effect, the division had redefined its understanding of tactical value. A dead infantryman no longer mattered. A delayed message was worth more. The Soviet command, unaware of the exact cause, attributed the disarray to jamming, sabotage, and camouflaged infiltrators. Signal units doubled encryption measures, introduced codeword changes twice daily, and began rotating operators under heavy guard. These measures slowed transmission further, adding self-imposed friction. The front's logistic trains stalled because clearance orders failed to arrive in sequence. Ammunition depots backed up behind frozen crossroads, creating perfect artillery targets once reconnaissance confirmed their positions. Within 48 hours, the entire sector transformed from offensive momentum to defensive hesitation. Soviet brigades began consolidating rather than advancing. German units, sensing reduced pressure, re-established a shallow but continuous line supported by a handful of functioning mortars and anti-tank guns. Unwittingly, the crazy plan had achieved what months of attritional defense could not. It bought time, space, and psychological reprieve. A dozen sharpshooters had redefined asymmetry on a battlefield, obsessed with tonnage and firepower. Their silent disruption rippled upward, illustrating a truth rarely acknowledged at the time, that in modern mechanized war, the first target was not the soldier, but the signal. By February 4th, the results of the experiment could be measured. Field intelligence summarized more than 60 disrupted radio exchanges, 14 destroyed telephone relays, and at least 22 confirmed kills of Soviet signalers in a 2-day period. What seemed minor in raw numbers had multiplied through the structure of command delay. Soviet artillery, deprived of timely spotting reports, overshot targets by kilometers. Counterattacks launched hours too late hit empty positions. The precision of the German snipers, though small in scale, had produced an exponential collapse in efficiency. In the German command's after-action log, analysts noted that Soviet command latency, the average delay between an order and its execution, had tripled. Instead of 10 to 15 minutes, orders now required up to 40. For mechanized or coordinated assaults, this delay meant disintegration of timing, nullifying numerical superiority. Soviet tank units, moving without infantry synchronization, became isolated targets for German anti-tank squads that had been nearly written off a week earlier. Logistically, the Soviet 33rd Army experienced a silent choke. Fuel convoys idled without routing updates. Evacuation teams lacked coordinates for medical withdrawal. German units, interpreting these pauses as panic, pushed minor counter-thrusts to probe reaction time. In nearly every instance, Soviet response was delayed or contradictory, proof that communication breakdown had reached operational scale. On the German side, the success was met with ambivalence. Senior officers feared that this was luck, not replicable doctrine. Yet lower-level commanders began applying the logic elsewhere. Artillery shells targeted antenna masts, patrols mined cable corridors, and reconnaissance teams mapped signal hubs rather than troop concentrations. It was the emergence of what would later be described in doctrinal studies as communication interdiction tactics, an unintentional precursor to electronic warfare by purely physical means. The balance at Kulm shifted perceptibly. For the first time in weeks, German morale indicators rose. Soldiers began believing that ingenuity could offset material inferiority. The Eastern Front, briefly, had become a laboratory for tactical evolution under extreme pressure. By February 5th, Soviet headquarters recognized the anomaly spreading across its communications grid. Reports from the 33rd and 39th Armies contained repeated phrases: signal isolation, order delay, runner loss. NKVD liaison notes even suspected internal sabotage. The problem was systemic, not localized. Red Army doctrine, emphasizing centralized control, depended on uninterrupted vertical links. Now, entire battalions were forced to rely on visual flares and field drummers, archaic methods in an industrial war. The Soviet countermeasure was swift. Engineer battalions were ordered to relay cable lines behind armored screens, while platoons of radio specialists moved forward under tank protection. But the environment worked against them. Frozen ground made digging impossible without explosives, and each detonation revealed their position. The German sniper network exploited this predictability. Every attempt to restore connectivity became a target. Sniper fire picked off linemen, while indirect fire from mortars forced constant relocation of switchboards. Frustrated, Soviet staff shifted strategy to redundancy. Triple routing of communication lines, relay points manned by auxiliary troops, and coded flag signals for local maneuvers. Yet every added layer slowed the decision chain. Orders reached companies hours late. By the time instructions to resume the offensive arrived, reconnaissance data was obsolete. Entire regiments launched into empty coordinates, wasting ammunition and fuel. For the Germans, this delay generated an unintended second-order benefit. Luftwaffe reconnaissance observed traffic jams of stalled Soviet vehicles, allowing accurate targeting by scarce artillery shells. Ammunition that once had to be rationed now achieved maximum effect. Wehrmacht staff began documenting communication-centered interdiction as a distinct operational tool, an analytical recognition that control networks were more decisive than sheer manpower. The crazy plan, conceived as a desperate improvisation, had now evolved into a doctrine in practice. Within 72 hours, the front had not merely stabilized, it had inverted momentum. Soviet units that had advanced 15 kilometers in a week now lost that ground without realizing how. By February 6th, word of the anomaly reached Army Group Center's intelligence section. Reports described communication paralysis within Soviet formations without corresponding rise in combat losses, an irregular pattern that drew analytical attention. Field officers concluded that the disruption was caused not by superior firepower, but by targeted interference with transmission nodes. The findings were circulated through command summaries labeled Beobachtungsbericht 12/34, an observation report rather than an official doctrine. In practice, however, imitation spread faster than authorization. Neighboring divisions began deploying hunter groups of 2 or 3 men, each carrying optics and submachine guns, to harass Soviet signal elements. Others coordinated artillery barrages to coincide with radio frequency spikes detected through primitive triangulation. It was the first coordinated effort to collapse an enemy network through non-electronic means, anticipating later Cold War principles of network disruption. For the Soviets, the phenomenon forced rapid adaptation. Signal troops received reinforced helmets and camouflage capes. Radio masts were shortened or concealed under tree branches. Commanders began decentralizing authority, allowing company officers to act autonomously if contact was lost. Ironically, this emergency decentralization improved Soviet flexibility, a structural reform born from crisis. Within weeks, similar tactics would appear across other fronts as an unspoken acknowledgement of vulnerability. Meanwhile, at Kolm, the German 218th Division consolidated its regained line. Patrols found abandoned Soviet equipment, including untransmitted message packets and broken radios, proof of systemic breakdown. Yet ammunition shortages and attrition remained severe. The sniper's innovation had changed tempo, not destiny. The Wehrmacht could delay collapse but not reverse the strategic imbalance of resources. Nevertheless, in Berlin, the High Command's Analytical Office briefly examined the Kolm report. A footnote in the February 1943 Wehrwissenschaftliche Mitteilungen referenced tactical interference through marksmanship, an obscure phrase that hinted at the larger lesson. Wars of industry could be influenced by minds operating outside doctrine. By February 7th, Soviet command identified the route of their disruption with precision. Field reconnaissance confirmed concentrated German sniper and scout presence near abandoned communication trenches. Orders were issued to neutralize these isolated marksman groups through saturation shelling rather than direct pursuit. Artillery regiments, once reserved for breakthrough fire, now expended thousands of shells suppressing suspected sniper nests. This redirection of fire diluted offensive potential but gradually restored command rhythm. German positions soon came under continuous bombardment. The micronetwork, effective because of stealth and dispersion, began to erode. Sniper pairs could not relocate quickly through snow crust, hardened by frost, and once exposed they lacked support weapons. Soviet spotters marked muzzle flashes with flare signals, guiding counter-battery fire that eliminated half the network in a day. The German innovation had reached its limit, not through conceptual failure, but through sheer material response. Still, the temporary paralysis had left measurable consequences. Soviet assault timetables had slipped by 72 hours. Fuel depots were misaligned with armored thrusts, and artillery resupply remained chaotic. This delay coincided with a thaw in southern sectors, forcing command to redirect reserves toward crumbling routes near Rousseau. In strategic terms, the sniper disruption had bought the German Ninth Army a rare commodity: operational time. At the tactical level, surviving German units integrated communication interdiction into standard defensive planning. Snipers were now assigned fixed observation arcs aimed at cable routes, bridges, and visible antennae. Machine gun teams coordinated suppressive fire only after confirmed sighting of signal personnel. Doctrine had evolved mid-battle. The network's destruction had transformed from improvisation to template. By the night of February 7th, the calm pocket stabilized into a frozen equilibrium. Both sides were exhausted, neither capable of decisive motion. Yet in staff journals and war diaries, analysts recorded something new: the recognition that warfare's outcome could hinge on the integrity of its information chain as much as on its firepower. The insight would echo long after the trenches fell silent. When the front quieted on February 8, the scale of what had transpired emerged only through reconstruction reports. German intelligence recovered Soviet message fragments that detailed 3 days of command chaos. Units had received conflicting orders, some instructed to advance while neighboring regiments were told to entrench. Tank brigades advanced without infantry cover, engineers dug trenches in the wrong sectors, and artillery barrages fell on empty ground. The disruption had not destroyed the Soviet offensive, but it had disoriented it so completely that coordination was effectively impossible. For the German side, post-battle assessments confirmed the disproportionate effect. A detachment of fewer than 20 men had influenced an operational front covering 30 kilometers. Analysts calculated that Soviet offensive velocity dropped by more than 60% during the disruption period. These figures appeared in divisional reports under the coded term Nachrichtenzerlegung, communication disassembly. Though never formalized as doctrine, the principle entered Wehrmacht. Tactical notes circulated to several corps commands by late February. Soviet counterintelligence, reviewing prisoner statements, misunderstood the cause. Believing the disruption stemmed from electronic interference or German cipher penetration, they requested radio shielding equipment from Moscow. The Red Army Signal Directorate responded by developing more mobile field radios with frequency hopping capabilities later in 1943, an unplanned technological acceleration triggered by a false assumption. Thus, the Kolm incident indirectly hastened Soviet radio modernization, linking a sniper experiment to a future leap in battlefield communication resilience. On the ground, the surviving German snipers were withdrawn, many reassigned to infantry after ammunition exhaustion. Few realized the historical significance of their operation. The sector remained frozen and static, but its lessons spread invisibly through reports, analyses, and countermeasures. The crazy plan faded from official communiques, dismissed as a field anomaly. Yet within the hidden layers of both armies' archives, it had rewritten the logic of tactical disruption, the art of paralyzing an enemy not by destruction but by silence. Months after the Kolm disruption, the Wehrmacht's tactical schools quietly dissected the incident. Training pamphlets for snipers and reconnaissance units began emphasizing functional targeting, prioritizing operators, signalers, and observers over infantry messes. Though not attributed to any single unit, the method reflected Kolm's logic. It transformed the sniper's role from solitary hunter to a node within a systemic weapon, aimed not at death count, but at temporal distortion. The delay between perception and reaction. Simultaneously, Soviet analysts conducted their own autopsies. Reports by the General Staff Academy classified the episode under local tactical degradation due to loss of transmission continuity. Their conclusion was blunt: command networks were as vulnerable as supply depots. This realization produced 2 long-term reforms: decentralization of decision authority to lower ranks, and investment in field cable duplication on an industrial scale. Ironically, the German experiment strengthened the very opponent it had temporarily crippled. In a broader context, the lessons of Kolm prefigured later doctrines. The German Army Group Center began experimenting with signal interdiction, using artillery and reconnaissance rather than snipers. By mid-1943, Soviet forces reciprocated with partisan actions targeting telephone exchanges behind enemy lines, an exact mirror of the Kolm logic, now applied in reverse. Both sides had internalized the same insight: information, once disrupted, could paralyze divisions faster than firepower could annihilate them. Post-war analysis by Soviet historians referenced anomalous communication breakdowns near Cholm, though without naming the sniper element. Western researchers only uncovered fragments of divisional logs decades later, confirming that the disruption had been deliberate, rather than coincidental. The experiment's anonymity became part of its strength, an idea without a visible author, propagating silently through doctrine, tactics, and eventually into modern concepts of information warfare. In retrospect, Cholm's frozen fields marked a pivot, the moment industrial war began evolving into informational war. By the end of 1943, the ripple from Cholm had reached a theoretical stage. German field manuals began using the phrase Verbindungszerstörung, connection destruction, to describe coordinated efforts against enemy communication systems. What began as a handful of snipers with scavenged rifles had matured into a conceptual foundation for modern command disruption. Though the term vanished with the collapse of the Reich, the idea survived, embedded in the language of post-war military studies: network paralysis, systemic interference, command latency. Soviet doctrine, redefined under constant threat of similar disruption, integrated resilience as a principle. By 1944, each Soviet rifle division carried redundant signal platoons, and field commanders were authorized to act independently when communication failed. That structural flexibility, born from humiliation at Cholm, became a core strength during Operation Bagration the following year. Ironically, the same insight that saved a German division contributed to Germany's eventual defeat when turned against it. In the archives, the sniper operation remained a footnote, overshadowed by larger tragedies. Yet its analytical significance endured. It revealed that the decisive variable in war was not always manpower or machinery, but synchronization. The experiment at Cholm proved that precision targeting of information flow could distort entire operations, demonstrating the fragility of industrial armies reliant on perfect coordination. Modern strategists studying early information warfare often trace their lineage to signals intelligence, encryption, and radar. Few recognize that its earliest field test occurred not in laboratories, but in frozen trenches where riflemen dismantled an army's nervous system bullet by bullet. The plan had been called verrückt, insane, by those who first heard it. In 2 days it changed an army's fate, rewired doctrines, and foreshadowed an era when control, not fire, would define victory. In the silence after the last shot, the battlefield remained unchanged, yet warfare itself had shifted, quietly, irreversibly, and forever. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.